The first midterm elections in American history obviously would have their roots in the first national elections to ever take place. The first presidential and congressional elections took place between 1788 and 1789, and they were directly the consequence of the ratification of the new U.S. Constitution, which is now the current U.S. Constitution. The previous Constitution was known as the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were deemed to be too weak in order to answer the nation's most important issues. So throughout the course of 1787 to 1789, a new constitution was ratified. The new constitution provided for a much more powerful and centralized federal government whose laws would be superior to that of state laws unless otherwise fully expressed within the Constitution itself. The first president of the United States of America was George Washington, the Revolutionary War hero. The first Congress of the United States was also elected alongside him. And for the most part, this Congress was composed of politicians who supported the new Constitution. Political parties did not, as we currently know them, exist yet. This is part of the reason why Washington is considered to be nonpartisan. But it was during this period that the partisan divide began to manifest itself. Also during this first midterm election, the bitter North-South divide would begin to show itself, and this would have dramatic implications for the country's history up until the present day. Washington was also considered nonpartisan, in part because of the fact that he did not want to give off the impression that he was a partisan president. Instead, he felt that the office was above that of the partisan bickering. Nonetheless, he was becoming under the increasing influence of a faction of conservatives who supported the new Constitution. This faction became known as the pro-administration party by its detractors. Along with supporting the new federal government under the new Constitution, they also supported the idea that the federal government had, quote, implied powers and should do everything that is, quote, necessary and proper in order to execute federal action. Washington, though being nonpartisan and under the increasing influence of these politicians, still had to deal with the major issues facing the United States, the most pressing of which was the issue of the nation's finances. Now, the states had borrowed on an individual level to pay for the War of Independence, and now with the war over, the funds borrowed in order to pay for that war were now effectively worthless. Alexander Hamilton, first Secretary of the Treasury, had proposed a bold solution that would arguably be his greatest legacy on American history. Hamilton proposed that the federal government should consolidate all the debts of the individual states and pay those said debts off at face value. A Bank of the United States would issue interest-bearing bonds to its shareholders who could get rich off the United States once when it was able to prove its credit worthiness by paying off these debts. Hamilton was a staunch protectionist and therefore supported a tariff on imported goods in order to protect domestic industries. On foreign policy issues, this faction, led by Hamilton, also supported improving ties with Great Britain, as it was by far the United States' largest trading partner. Because the merchants and financiers were mostly based out of the northern cities, the pro-administration party had its base of support in the growing financial centers of New York and Boston. Hamilton himself, after all, hailed from New York and was a prominent figure in New York society. Washington, from the beginning of his administration, supported the plan. However, throughout the course of the 1790s, there was a growing voice of liberals who opposed what they believed to be an unnecessary breach of contract within the United States government and an increasing authority imposed by the federal government. The new anti-administration party, again, was an informal faction, but they consolidated themselves around Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, both Virginia planters from both Virginia planters. Now, the first Congress of the United States was overwhelmingly pro-administration. But during the course of this first and second Congress, the anti-administration party began to become more assertive. First and foremost, what the anti-administration party believed was that the new Constitution granted far too much power to the federal government. Now, it would seem odd for us today for liberals to protest the size of the federal government when we listen to 21st century political rhetoric, but you have to put yourself within the perspective of those who lived in late 18th century and early 19th century America. It was an unaccountable, unrepresentative foreign government far off from the United States, the British government, that had imposed a series of taxes without proper representation on the colonists. It was for this grievance that the colonists decided that it was necessary to break away from Great Britain and establish their own country. Jefferson was keen to not repeat these same mistakes, and so he firmly believed that the new government should be much more decentralized and should better accommodate the needs of the individual states. Jefferson also believed in the nation of small independent farmers. He did not agree with Hamilton's proposed banking reforms. He believed that they would benefit the wealthy far too much, especially those in New York and Boston, and would harm the southern and western states instead, which were mostly agrarian and rural. Jefferson also strongly believed in free trade, which would lower tariffs or eliminate them altogether on imported goods. This would benefit farmers as both small and large. Jefferson also strongly believed that since there was no wording within the United States Constitution to authorize the chartering of a national bank, then no national bank should be created. Instead, he believed that individual states should charter their own banks to pay off their individual debts. Jefferson, in addition to believing that the nation should promote free trade, believed that the nation's future belonged in the hands of small independent farmers. Jefferson believed that the yeoman farmer was, quote, the chosen people of God. What he meant by this was the fact that small independent farmers would be self-reliant and not be dependent upon major industries and a paternalistic hierarchy in order to keep the nation prosperous and free. There should be small independent farmers who could produce their own welfare. To this end, Jefferson believed that the United States' future lied westward and should expand as much as possible and acquire new lands from Spain and France. Jefferson was also a staunch liberal on foreign policy issues. He was skeptical of the idea of a standing army and was very much so a supporter of revolutionary France, which had come into existence in 1789. Contrast that with his views on Great Britain, and he was vehemently skeptical